In this video, I'm going to give a complete makeover to this mid-century style coffee table, which I picked up recently at a local house clearance for just £5. The table has some serious problems at the moment. As you can see, there's lots of wobble to the table and not all of the feet reach the floor. There's actually a 20mm gap here, and that's because the top is extremely warped and twisted, as you can see from this shot. Sighting down the length of the long edges, one side seemed relatively straight, but the other was like a banana. Aside from that, the top was horrible. It appears to be a thin plywood that's been stained really badly at some point in its life. It also wasn't stuck down to the frame in many places. The idea I had for the top was to apply a new veneer to it, something which I've never done before and I'll attempt later on in this video. And on the underside of the table you can see that it's not very well made. There's not really any structural integrity here, and that's probably why it's so badly out of shape. On the plus side though, I really like these legs on the table. In fact, I would have paid £5 just for the legs. These gold feet are pretty cool, and they just unscrew from the top, as you can see. And I generally like the shape of the table, so it was worth £5 to me, and I thought it'd make a good project to try and turn this into something beautiful.
The first task was to try and straighten out the top. I offered up a straight edge to the side of the table that was badly bent, and in the centre there was a pretty serious gap measuring 9mm. First, I clamped the tabletop face down onto the flat surface of my workbench. And then I removed these hardwood bracing pieces. I figured there was no point leaving them in because clearly they were not doing their intended job of keeping the top straight properly, and I could make use of this hardwood in another project. To straighten up the bent side, I decided I'd use this thin offcut of 18mm hardwood ply. You can see here that this is pretty flexible when the layers of the plywood are held horizontally, but when the layers of the plywood are vertical, it's much more resistant to flexing, so I'd use it in that orientation to help straighten up the warped side of the table. I marked up how long I needed it, cut it to length at the bandsaw, and then with a straight bit in my router and a straight edge clamped on to guide the router, I started cutting a housing joint. I took multiple passes, lowering the bit each time until I was about 3/4 of the way through the thickness of the wood. Because my router bit measured around 12.5mm and the thickness of the plywood was around 17.5, I set my calipers to 5mm, which was the difference, and I scribed a mark, and then I could line up the straight edge with that mark on both sides and take another pass with the router to widen the joint. I checked that the plywood was a nice snug fit, and it was, so then I made multiple passes again to get to the depth I wanted. I then squared up the ends of the grooves with a chisel, and the plywood fitted really nicely, so I added wood glue to the joint, and then I could push the piece of plywood in. I clamped it in place, and I also drove some screws from the inside of the table through the plywood just to help provide the maximum amount of bracing in the best way that I could come up with to force it flat. To provide some extra thickness to the tabletop and also extra bracing to help keep the tabletop flat, I first sanded the underside just to clean off any old dirt, and then I cut a piece of 12mm MDF to size at the table saw and miter saw to fit inside the wooden frame. I applied a generous layer of wood glue and then added the MDF, and then I piled on lots of heavy things and left it for the glue to dry. While I was waiting for that, I could start working on the legs, which were currently painted black and had some sort of sticky sellotape residue on them. I decided to scrape the legs to clean them up with my card scraper, and underneath the paint I found that the legs were made of solid beech, so I decided I'd keep them unpainted. My small carbide scraper came in handy to scrape the paint off near the feet. I then sanded the legs at 100 grit, and I decided to give them a coat of walnut Brywax to stain them a darker colour, which would work better with the top. I wiped off the excess wax with another cloth, and then they looked really nice. It took quite a lot of time scraping all of the paint off, but I'm glad I did it. Here's a before and after. After a few hours, I could see if the tabletop was now holding its newly flattened shape, and it was, so that was great. I flipped the tabletop over and now I could start working on gluing down the loose top. I mixed up some epoxy and worked it into the joints as best I could, and then I stuck some packing tape to a block of wood to use as a clamping caul. The packing tape ensures that the wood glue wouldn't stick to it. After about 20 minutes I removed the clamps and that had worked great too. It was nice and flat and nothing was loose. I filled any small gaps around the edges with some wood filler. And then I did some scraping and sanding just to smooth everything over and prepare the surface ready for a veneer to be applied, which I'll do later. The underside of the table also got a bit of a clean up. I scraped the hardwood to remove all of the old dirt and watermarks, and then I applied some walnut bry wax to that too, to give it a darker colour tone and bring out the grain more. I could also now remove the excess from the plywood brace that I added earlier, and I used my planer for that just to bring it down flush with the frame. As I mentioned near the start of the video, I wanted to apply a new veneer to the tabletop, and this is something that I've never tried before. I had some nice walnut veneer. This was given to me a few years ago by a local retiring woodworker, and it wasn't in great shape. There were a few cracks and it wasn't perfectly flat either, but I hoped that I could make use of it here. And by putting two of the veneers together, I decided that it would be really cool to book match the grain. But to do that, I'd first need to get a perfectly straight edge where the veneers would meet together. So I've got a couple of millimeters of the edge of the veneer protruding beyond these two plywood boards, and I'm going to try and plane these edges flush with one another. Okay, that seems to have worked. The edges of the veneer are now flush with the edges of the plywood. They seem to join together pretty well, so next I added some masking tape. And then I flipped the veneer, and by propping it up in the centre where the join was, I could add a bead of wood glue. I could then prop up each long edge of the veneer to apply a bit of pressure to the joint, and I wiped away the excess glue with a damp cloth. I'd used some of this contact adhesive to glue down the veneer. I masked off where I didn't want to apply any glue, and then applied it to the tabletop, spreading it out with the edge of a plywood board to get a nice thin and even coat. And I did the same to the veneer too. The instructions said to wait around 10 minutes for the glue to go tacky. I used a couple of dowels between the tabletop and the veneer just to stop the two glued surfaces touching, and that gave me time to position one end of it correctly, working from one side to the other and gradually removing the dowels. And I used a block of plywood to apply downward pressure to remove any air bubbles. So that didn't go particularly well, to be honest. Over here you'll see that the veneer cracked quite badly, and as I was applying it, the crack just kept going and going. So it's pretty much all of the way through the piece of veneer, and then at the end it gets really bad. So I'm not sure if this is going to be salvageable or not. The other side went much better. I did have a crack up here somewhere, but I managed to join that together.
I didn't enjoy using contact adhesive at all. It's really gloopy and difficult to work with. To be honest, I wish I'd used something else. I don't have much experience using it though, so maybe I didn't apply it in the correct way, or maybe the stuff that I bought just isn't very good quality. But anyway, despite those difficulties and the fact that the veneer is now cracked down the length of the table, I think I'm going to persevere with it and try and make it work.
I used a trim router to cut away the excess veneer around the edges. I also cut it to length using a knife and ruler. And I used my block plane just to refine the edges some more, followed by some sanding. I also used some white spirit to clean off any contact adhesive that I had accidentally got onto the top of the veneer, and that did a good job of cleaning it off. I also rubbed some white spirit onto the rest of the veneer just to see how it would look with finish applied and check that it was clean. I then wanted to try filling in the crack in the veneer, and for that I used some epoxy mixed with some mahogany sawdust. Once the epoxy had dried, I scraped away the excess. For the short ends of the table, I applied more veneer, but this time I used wood glue because I really didn't want to work with the contact adhesive again. I used masking tape to hold the veneer in place, and then I clamped down a piece of plywood, again with some packing tape on it just to make sure that it wouldn't stick to the glue. That seemed to work well, so I trimmed those edges with my router too and refined the edges and the corners again. I did some final sanding to the tabletop, and I decided to do that by hand as I didn't want to risk sanding through the veneer. And then I blew away the dust with my air blower.
So it'd be really easy to pretend on video that this project was a success, but unfortunately it all went very wrong from this point onwards, so it's confession time. At this point I thought that while the veneering hadn't gone particularly well, I could probably still salvage this project and make it work. It certainly wasn't going to be perfect, but it looked like the imperfections weren't going to be very noticeable, and I'd already spent about a day and a half working on this table, and as it doesn't have much value at all, I didn't really want to invest too much more time into it. I went ahead and applied finish to the tabletop. I chose water-based varnish. I applied it in the direction of the grain to help minimise brush strokes, and after leaving the varnish to dry overnight, this is where I unfortunately found some big problems, which meant that this project was a failure. I'm not sure what happened, but after the finish had dried, I found that there were some pretty big bubbles sitting beneath the veneer. These bubbles were not there before I applied the finish, or at least they certainly weren't noticeable, and I think I definitely would have noticed them while I was doing all of the sanding. So I don't really know how or why the finish brought out these bubbles, but one thing's for sure, the veneering was a failure. Removing the warp from the tabletop and refinishing the legs worked out really well, so it wasn't a complete disaster, and I definitely learnt a few things. This might not be the last that you see of this project, because I'm tempted to try sanding down the veneer to get it flat, applying a filler to any of the areas that bubbled up, and then trying the veneering process again, but using wood glue instead of contact adhesive. Ideally for wood glue you'd use some sort of vacuum press to apply even pressure to stick the veneer to the tabletop, but I don't have one of those. I do have a few other ideas about how I could clamp it up though, and part of me doesn't want this to be the end of this project. I kind of don't want it to beat me. But right now I have a couple of commissions that I need to start working on, so I'm going to shelve this project while I give it some more thought. If you want to see me tackle it again in a video, then please let me know in the comments. I think I definitely need a bit of encouragement if I'm going to try this again. Veneering is not easy. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope that you learned something, like how not to apply a veneer. Please subscribe for more weekly woodworking videos, and thank you for watching.